Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. In this first hour, we're going to do a little bit of teaching, which I think you will appreciate, and then we're going to get back into the news. If you've not heard, Stephen Breyer, who sits on the Supreme Court, will be stepping down. That provides an opportunity for President Biden to put someone else in his place, and we'll talk about that next hour. We'll also get into, of course, an ongoing discussion about Ukraine. I want to try to give both sides. It is amazing to me how one side is vilifying the other when there are certainly some very significant issues at stake in Ukraine, but there are also very significant dangers. So we'll talk about that. And before the hour's up, I want to talk about a couple of videos that are really going viral. One, a video showing the transporting of male migrants all over the United States, and some comments have been made about that. Also, when the immigration numbers came out, a trick that is used by the Biden administration to downplay any kind of media attention in that. Well, we're talking about videos. Probably also we'll talk about a video of a very prominent actor comedian who was showing a video of people looting, I think it was a Rite Aid store in New York City, and seemed shocked by that. And I thought, haven't you seen all these other videos? But okay, we'll get into that. We have a lot of people making arguments that if you don't get your COVID shot, you might be denied health care. That seemed a little bit strange, but we now have from a number of reputable sources an individual who was available for a heart transplant, number one on the list, and now has been completely removed from the list because he did not get the COVID shot. So we'll talk about that. And before we're all done, of course, looking ahead to the elections, the 2022 elections, and some great material that we've posted on our website. So if you want to read ahead, those articles are on the website, but we thought it would be good, as we do from time to time, to talk philosophy, because after all, this idea of philosophy is instrumental in our understanding of Scripture. It's even helpful in understanding some of the statements that have been made over these many years, these many millennia, by the way, by various Christian authors. So we wanted to bring back to the microphone Dr. Louis Markos, an individual who is professor of English and also a scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, has his PhD from the University of Michigan. We have talked with him in the past about, for example, such issues as classical education, his book, Restoring Beauty, the Good, the True, and the Beautiful in the Writings of C.S. Lewis, On the Shoulders of Hobbits, The Road to Virtue in Tolkien and Lewis. But this book is From Plato to Christ, kind of a follow-up to his earlier one on From Achilles to Christ. So, Dr. Louis Markos, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby. It's great to be back on.
Plato is somebody that almost all of us were required to study, probably in high school. But my one gripe, if I can make it, of my high school education is we read Plato's Republic, we talked about it, but we never made any of the connections. And it seems to me that those connections, which is what you're doing in this book, are the most interesting. And it wasn't until, for example, I was in graduate school, we're studying political theory, that I began to see the significance of Plato to the various political theologians. We've had Nancy Pearcey on, who you know, talking about the body and talking about Neoplatonism. And it does seem to me that sometimes we have actually deprived students of the value value of the classics because we never make those connections. And you can understand why a lot of kids say, why do I have to read this book? It doesn't have anything relevant to our world that is here today. And yet, if you think about it, almost all of the various philosophical statements some people have suggested are a footnote either to Plato or Socrates. Your thoughts?
It's amazing. I mean, I'll go back, something you said just before we started was, again, why is philosophy important? And this book is called Plato to Christ. I wrote an earlier book called Atheism on Trial. And I want to remind people, first of all, that philosophy is not this movement from sort of belief in God to belief in science, or belief in absolute truth to belief in everything that's relative. At all times, there have been people who have believed in God and believed in truth, and there's been other people who didn't. And there's a sort of pendulum swing as to which person is stronger. But we need to get away from this sort of evolutionary idea that we've put all that behind us, okay? Before Plato came on the scene, there were people called pre-Socratic philosophers, many of whom believe things that are very similar to the relativists and postmodernists and deconstructionists of today. And then along comes Plato and says, no, there is truth, there is goodness, truth, and beauty. There are standards. We have a soul. And he was ascendant, right? But then later on, there's a pendulum swing. And the people that don't believe in truth come into power. So back and forth, back and forth. We need to go back to Plato. And if we do, we'll realize that Plato answered the kinds of things that new atheists and theological liberals are still saying today. So the first thing we need to do, Kerby, is break out of this evolutionary mindset that says everything moves from sort of ignorance to enlightenment, darkness to light, belief to skepticism. You know what I mean? And so we need to go back to Plato, who's 2,500 years ago, and see that he was right in his day, and he can even help set Christians straight today, even though he was a pre-Christian, didn't know the scriptures, didn't know Christ, obviously, and yet he says things that I think can get the church back on track, as ironic as that sounds.
Well, again, I forgot to mention your previous book, Atheism on Trial, Refuting the Modern Arguments Against God. But again, you can go back to your first chapter on Socrates, the Sophist, and the Pre-Socratics. Let me just mention that this book is published by InterVarsity Press. It is about 230 pages, 12 chapters, one section on Plato's kind of pre-Christian vision, the other on Plato's Christian legacy. And you said something in passing it's worth mentioning before we get into some of the details in the book, and that is some people might think, well, why do I study Plato? He didn't have access to the revelation of Moses, of David, of the Old Testament, certainly the future revelation coming from Jesus himself. So there has always been kind of a bias in the modern world, first against that which is old and ancient and irrelevant. But there's also sometimes been, don't you think, maybe a bias by Christians against anything that isn't part of God's revelation?
There really is, and that's why we need to be continually reminded of the distinction between general revelation and special revelation. This is clear in the book of Romans. It's actually clear in Calvin's Institutes. That's the way Calvin begins his Institutes. Special revelation is the way God speaks directly, as he did through the Old and New Testament, through the prophets, and of course supremely through Christ himself. But that is not the only way God speaks. Special revelation is only the direct speak to us, but he also speaks to all people through what's called general revelation. Yes. And general revelation comes to us through creation, that's Romans 1. It comes to us through our conscience, that's Romans 2. God speaks through our reason. He speaks, yes, through our imagination. Now, again, we are fallen, okay? We are depraved. We have to have a measure, but we can come up with things that are true. That doesn't mean those things will save us. We need the special revelation of Christ, but there is truth in those things. But we kind of forget Melchizedek was not a Jew, right? And yet he knew truth, right? Yes. Remember the story of Moses, where his father-in-law, the pagan Jethro, gave him some very, very good political advice about, having people under you, right? So we can learn from the pagans, even in the Bible.
I think we can. The book is entitled From Plato to Christ. We'll get back into it right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, a news story reported that the University of Memphis was offering professors $3,000 to infuse their courses with diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. When we talked about this on my radio program, my guest wondered if professors who were already doing this for free might feel slighted. Social justice concepts like critical race theory and anti-racism have been injected into college classes for some time. But this announcement brought these ideas out in the open. An all-faculty email obtained by the Free Beacon shows that the university offered a $1,500 stipend after professors redesigned their curricula, with another $1,500 after teaching the redesigned course. The university working group links to a report that emphasizes the need for anti-racism, which is a term popularized by Ibram X. Kendi. It calls for designing anti-racist syllabi and developing skills and appropriate dispositions for facilitating anti-racist classroom discussion. As you might imagine, the proposal has attracted the attention of Tennessee lawmakers who are critical of offering such incentives to professors, and one professor at the university explained that they have had a hard time retaining good faculty at our salary levels, so anytime you see money being spent on non-student or non-faculty causes, it makes you scratch your head. You've probably heard pundits, politicians, and professors dismiss the idea that social justice ideas like critical race theory and anti-racism are being taught in education. This latest example not only shows that these ideas are being taught, but at least one university wants to provide a financial incentive for teaching those ideas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Dr. Louis Markos with us, and again, he is a professor at Houston Baptist University, author of a number of books, including this one, From Plato to Christ. And Louis, for just a minute, let's, if we can, maybe spend some time looking at what you call the pre-Socratics and others. Even in the section you have there, you talk about Jacques Derrida and the deconstructionists. We talk sometimes on this program about postmodernists, but whether individuals even know who those people are, whether people even understand what those words mean, there is a sense in which there's nothing new under the sun, because you have this rejection of the belief in truth. And listeners today might, as they're going out there, maybe sharing their faith, have somebody say, well, I'm glad that you believe that. That's your truth, but it's not my truth. And we have different views of truth. Of course, Plato comes around and says, no, I believe in truth with a capital T, but he was reacting to a group not unlike some of the so-called new atheists. Is that fair?
It is true. Now, some of them we call pre-Socratics, others we call sophists, and they sort of overlap with each other, like there was a guy named Gorgias. And a lot of the sophists believed that morality and ethics change wildly from one city-state to another. Now, of course, cultures change, right? As C.S. Lewis would say, the rules of propriety change from culture to culture, but basic morality does not. Basic morality is there, and it is written in our conscience. And what Plato did is he sought after not truth with a small t, not your truth or my truth or that Sparta's truth or Athens' truth or Corinth's truth. He was seeking truth with a capital T. Now, when you read Plato, it's often a little bit confusing, right? Because Plato rarely speaks in his own voice. he usually speaks through the voice of his teacher, Socrates.
Yes.
Socrates came before Plato. Socrates did not write anything down. There are a few other people that mention him, Xenophon and others, but the main person is Plato. And when you really read the dialogues carefully, and I really try to parse these out in my book, you can see the difference. You can generally tell when it is really just Socrates speaking, because in the early Platonic dialogues, we often have a place where there's this Socratic dialogue. Socrates will ask somebody, often a sophist, what is courage, or what is beauty, or what is truth? And they'll give an answer, and Socrates will proceed through question and answer to sort of unpack and even deconstruct that definition to show that it's not really an absolute trait, that's missing something. You're just giving me a kind of courage or a kind of truth, but you're not really telling me what truth is in and of itself. Now, the early dialogues are a little bit frustrating because usually they end with what's called an impasse.
Yes.
In other words, Socrates explodes everybody's definition, and they're like, well, what is it? Oh, I don't know. and it just goes over and ends, right? But that's because Socrates is the first step. If I am trying to see T with a capital T, right, and I'm looking at a board, and on that board are all these little t's all over the place, I can't see the capital T until I wipe away all those little t's, right? I can't see God until I wipe away all the idols that I've put up in the place of God. So Socrates needs to come around first and do something that almost sounds like deconstruction, break down what we think. But it is not like modern deconstruction an end in itself. You break it all down and you don't build anything else up because you don't believe there is any truth. No, it is the first step. It's like clearing the ground before you build a real structure that will last. And in Plato's middle dialogues, like the Republic, now we start moving from the negative part, wiping away that which is not truth, and moving forward, if it's the Republic, what is justice with a capital J. If you read the Republic, the first part of the Republic, Socrates demolishes two things that are not justice. But he doesn't stop there. He now moves on to define what justice is. And that's what happens. The Gorgias, the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, these are some of the great middle dialogues that really is Plato at his best.
We can talk about the Republic because obviously the issue of justice. Later on, we get into the issue of laws, and there is a real sense that almost every political theorist has, in one way or another, had to address some of the things that he raises there. But as you also point out, and we're going to get, I'm sure, very quickly into the second part of your book, many Christian theologians and individuals, early church fathers, as well as certainly Augustine, all the way down to, of course, you mentioned C.S. Lewis, have had to contend with some of the teachings there of Plato. But for a young person that maybe has read the Republic and goes, I don't get it. What's the significance? What's the foundation upon which Plato is writing this, and how is this influential in our 21st century world?
Well, let me take a step back for a second, Kerby. One of the reasons I felt absolutely compelled to write this book, all right, as you know, even to today, the typical sort of liberal mainline theologian, whenever he sees something in the Bible he doesn't like and wants to get away with it, what he does is he blames it on St. Paul. Well, that's Paul, I only listen to the words in red, right? You're familiar with that.
Oh, yes.
But what I found over the last couple of decades is a lot of, what do you want to call them, neoconservatives, people that call themselves evangelical. If there's something they don't like, they're not going to attack Paul. They're going to blame it on Plato. And I've seen this happen so much. And one of the things that a lot of modern evangelicals don't like is distinction. They've fallen into the trap of egalitarianism, or what they call today equity, that everybody should be the same, that God expects everybody to be the same, break down all distinctions. No. That may be fairness, but that is not justice. And we need to go back to Plato to understand that there is something good to hierarchy. Part of justice is everybody doing what they are meant to be doing. You're in a society where each of us has a role and a calling and a gifting. And when we do that together, when we find that balance, that is what... It's not breaking down all distinctions. Now, a lot of people would say, no, you're wrong. What about Jesus washing the disciples' feet? Well, all by itself, that may seem to suggest a sort of radical equity where everybody's the same and there are no distinctions. But if you read it carefully, it begins by saying, Jesus, knowing all authority had been given unto him, from a position of strength, he bends down and washes their feet. And after it's all over and the disciples are looking at him like, what's this all about? He says, you call me Lord and Master, and you are right to do so. He's not breaking down, but now you see what I have done. This is a new kind of stewardship, right? This is the rightful king, the rightful Lord, the rightful master, who from that position of knowing what he does is a steward. And probably the most famous thing people know about Plato is the idea of the philosopher king.
Right.
The true philosopher, the one who knows truth and justice and goodness and beauty, who knows the standard, because if you don't know the standard, you can't be a judge because you have nothing to judge it against. That is the person that doesn't want to get all messed up with the world and politics. But in a kind of humility, he needs to be forced to come forward and be a king because he's the very person who has the knowledge that will allow him to judge and adjudicate between things because he knows the standard. And that's the more core of what's going on in the Republic. And then one more quick thing. A lot of people are like, oh, he's making this state that nobody wants to live in. Okay, first of all, the Republic is really not about making a utopia. The Republic is a book about what is justice. And by this we mean, what is justice in the human soul? Well, the trouble is, you really can't see it or smell it or taste it or touch it or hear it. So what Plato decides to do, Socrates and the people, is, wait a minute, let's take justice in the soul, that's what we will call the microcosm, and let's blow it up onto the macrocosm. Let's blow it up and create a perfectly just state. Once we've determined that, we can work our way backwards to what we're really interested in, and what is the state of the just soul. And the just soul has that same kind of balance between the different parts of the soul. And so that's really what it's about. And part of it, if you read it carefully, they just get carried away. And his young pupils keep forcing him to say more things. And he's like, look, I'm not interested. Come on. We're having a lot of fun. We want to know how this is going on. But that's really not at the core of what he's doing. He's trying to get to the core of what is the just man.
Again, some very great material on natural callings and the philosopher kings, but need to take a break. When we come back, though, certainly one aspect of Plato, which we need to get into, is this idea of a body-soul division. Is there a pre-existent soul, and a number of other issues, which, again, oftentimes are discussed among Christians, and I think you will find that very helpful. And then we'll get into not only some of the things that were said in the past, but also what has been the influence of Plato and his Christian legacy in terms of some of these early Christian writers and early church fathers, as well as other individuals throughout Western civilization. So a lot to cover, and we're privileged to have with us for the rest of this hour Dr. Louis Markos. He is a professor at Houston Baptist University, author of quite a number of books which we've mentioned, including this one, which we have available on our website. From Plato to Christ will continue right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Professor Louis Markos for the rest of this hour. The book is entitled From Plato to Christ, How Platonic Thought Shaped the Christian Faith. Book came out a couple of months ago. It is available in your local bookstore perhaps, but we have a link so that you can find it on our website at pointofview.net. And Louis, let's, if we can, spend some time talking about this whole idea of body and soul division. There's, of course, a section in the Republic about what you might call soul war and the whole issue of the sin-sick soul and the rest. And of course, you also have sections later on when we talk about Augustine growing up with the Manichaeans, or even Gnosticism and all the rest. There's always been this, if you will, almost false dichotomy between the flesh is evil, but the soul is good. And to this day, we still find ourselves with that issue. And I think in some respects comes from, frankly, a misreading of some of the things Plato was saying. But help us understand that, because it's an important issue of whether we look at who we are right now, the new heavens and the new earth, a resurrection body. All of that really comes back to some of these ideas that go all the way back to Plato, don't they?
It really does. And I'm so thankful for the work of N.T. Wright, who reminded us all in the Christian world that heaven is not going to be floating around on clouds. The new heaven and new earth will be a physical place. God made the body. He made matter. He likes it. He called it good. But so many Americans, without realizing it, are Gnostic, or sometimes it's called dualist, this idea that soul is good, body is bad. One of my very favorite, top 10 favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life. Great movie. A lot of Christian values in it. But it perpetuated that nonsense that when we die, we become angels. We do not become angels when we die. They're totally different species than we are, different creation than we are, right? We are meant to be body and soul. Now, one of the greatest weaknesses of Plato is, again, in a lot of Plato, there is this idea that the body is a sort of prison house of the soul.
Yes.
And salvation really means getting rid of the body. Now, there is some of this in Plato. We need to be fair. But a lot of the extreme comes later in what are called the Neoplatonists. Later on, people like Plotinus, and they kind of push Plato farther than he wants to go. In fact, there is a dialogue by Plato called the Timaeus, which is not quite as negative about the body and not quite as negative about creation. But still, you do see it in Plato. I mean, really, to a certain extent, I think there's a need for special revelation to really understand not only that the body's good, or at least it was made good, right, but to understand what we are as human beings. We are not souls trapped in a body. We are enfleshed souls. I am not half body and half soul. I am fully body and fully soul. Just like Jesus is not half God and half man, but fully human and fully divine, we are fully physical and fully spiritual beings. I don't think that's something that Plato could have really comprehended. And if you think about it, in Acts chapter 17, when Paul speaks at the Areopagus and preaches to the Stoics and Epicureans, they listen very carefully till he talks about the resurrection of the body. And they're like, whoa, what's that all about? Why would I want my body back once I got rid of it? Right? So this is difficult. But as you already said, Kerby, people today, even Christians today, have a hard time understanding this. Right? But again, it's hard. We can't expect Plato to understand everything. But there is something we need to understand, that Plato does remind us in a good way that heaven is more real and more physical even than the earth, and God is more real than we are. Why do we always use, I'm quoting C.S. Lewis now, why do we always use negative language about God? We are corporeal, God is non-corporeal, God is non-bodily. No, God is not non-corporeal, God is trans-corporeal. It's not like we're personal and God's impersonal. If anything, God is transpersonal, more than. And that's why the very end of the Chronicles of Narnia, they speak of our world as the Shadowlands, right? Not that we're completely unreal, but that, compared to the thundering reality of heaven, it is almost like living in a shadowland. So some of it is a little bit of hyperbole that we need to be reminded that it's not like this world is real and substantial, and heaven is shadowy and insubstantial, and a bunch of people floating on clouds. No, God is more than we are, not less than we are. And so in some ways, Plato can get us back on track to remind us that the cause is greater than the effect. The origin, the beginning, is greater than that which is created. And so, we have to be careful. Again, there's not this understanding in Plato that we're in flesh souls. I really think there's a real need for special revelation to make that clear. But Plato will remind us, again, of the unseen world is actually more real than the seen world. And remember, there is one place in Scripture that sounds like Plato could have written, and I'm not saying he was influenced by Plato, and that's in the book of Hebrews, when it talks about how the earthly temple is just a shadow of the real temple, in the throne room of God, which is certainly what Isaiah is seeing in Isaiah 6 and what John is seeing in Revelation 4. And I even think Ezekiel in chapter 1 is seeing the throne room on the move. Okay, but he's seeing it as a real and a more real thing. And so it's odd that Plato, while that's his greatest problem, also can help ground us. That's why at the end of the last battle, the end of the Chronicles of Narnia, the professor is realizing the real Narnia is in heaven. He says, it's all in Plato, it's all in Plato. What do they teach these kids today?
Just for a second, you were taking Hebrews. Another verse that came to mind to be 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17, about this idea of light affliction and an eternal weight of glory. Of course, because that one, again, talks about the fact that there's really glory right now. This is momentary and light affliction and those kinds of things. Anyway, just another way of making that same case. But help us out for
That's beautiful. And, the most Platonic Christian of the 20th century wrote his greatest sermon called The Weight of Glory, and that's C.S. Lewis. Reminding us of the true weight of glory. That if you read The Great Divorce, heaven is more substantial. The people, the damned souls, they can't even bend the grass in heaven, because heaven is so much more real than the earth, and certainly more real than hell.
Again, I would encourage everybody to read The Eternal Weight of Glory, written about the time, I think, during the World War II, so that's significance as well as its connection to 2 Corinthians 4. But just before we take a break, I thought maybe you could clear up something. It surfaced when we've had discussions about reincarnation. We've had Lee Strobel on, of course, recently, The Case for Heaven. We've had Doug Groteis on, who's written about reincarnation, and that is, there's a place where Plato is sort of musing about reincarnation. You talk about this later on in the book, and he's really thinking about it in sort of kind of a hypothetical way. And of course, did not have access to revelation, did not have, of course, the belief in the incarnation and resurrection of Christ. And so in some respects, we always think of reincarnation coming from the East, but he was kind of musing about that even in his writings, wasn't he?
He was, and he was influenced by the great thinker Pythagoras, who seemed clearly to believe in reincarnation, and that's why his followers were vegetarians, because you might come back as an animal, right? But Plato, here's the interesting thing. Plato does talk about reincarnation quite a bit, but he only talks about it in the myths. When you read Plato, there's the dialogue part, and then there's the story he tells to sort of incarnate what he's doing, and only in those places. And there's also something in Plato that, reincarnation is, of course, completely incompatible with Christianity. But there is something else in Plato that could be, I would call it abiblical, and that's what's called the pre-existence of the soul.
Yes.
And that's the belief that perhaps our soul existed briefly in heaven before it entered our body, and therefore, to a certain extent, we have a prenatal memory of heaven. I wouldn't call that unbiblical. Now, be careful. The Mormons, LDS, they believe that our souls not only pre-exist, but that our souls have always existed. That is completely incompatible with Christianity. It breaks down the distinction between God and man. In other words, the pre-existence, God still created our soul, but there was a moment when we were in heaven, and we have some memory of that. And in fact, you understand, Plato, he believes the Socratic method works, but because by a question and answer, it brings back our memory of that time when we had a perception of heaven and the forms and what is real and what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. And so part of learning is trying to get people to remember what's been implanted in us. Now,
Yes.
I don't know if our soul pre-existed, but I do think that all of us retain what I would call an antenatal memory of Eden. And what do I mean by that? All real, believing Christians, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. We participated in Adam's sin. Well, then we should also participate in the day or two or however long Adam and Eve were in the garden. And I think we all
Very interesting.
maintain a sort of memory of the garden, and that's why we're never quite at home in the earth.
Makes sense. C.S. Lewis writes about that. Matter of fact, after the break, let's get into C.S. Lewis. You have C.S. Lewis's Christian Platonism, and again, some of that comes from mere Christianity. Some of it comes from Narnia, so we're going to talk about that. All of you perhaps are familiar with C.S. Lewis. How does Plato and C.S. Lewis come together? Well, Louis Markos will help us out right after this. Platonism.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Professor Louis Markos, again with Houston Baptist University, author of the book From Plato to Christ. We're skipping over all sorts of sections on the myths, the laws, Dante, Augustine, and all the rest, but I thought it would be appropriate, maybe, Louis, at the end to talk about C.S. Lewis, because you have a whole chapter on that. And again, for our listeners, they perhaps have read the Chronicles of Narnia, the Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity. If not, they maybe seen the films of the Narnia series, or maybe more recently the film The Most Reluctant Convert with Max McLean. And so if you go to any writing by C.S. Lewis, you realize that he certainly does pull not only from the Bible, but for Plato as well. Can you explain how that all comes together? Because it's one of the most significant chapters in your book, I think.
He really does. Now, first quickly, sort of in his more philosophical, theological thing, Plato reminds us of something absolutely essential, that the cause has to be greater than the effect. Now, why is this important? This is important because Sigmund Freud wrote a book called Moses and Monotheism, and he tried to say that God the Father is just a human invention. In other words, we start with earthly fathers and we project that upward and we invent God the Father. No, Plato would say, no, Lewis would say, no traditional philosophers would say, it is the heavenly Father that's the primary thing, and earthly fatherhood is a reflection of that, ultimately a lesser reflection of that. And the sort of proof is you may have grown up with a terrible father, and yet somehow you know your father is bad. Why? Because implanted in us is a sort of knowledge of divine fatherhood, right? A lot of people say there can't be a God because there's so much injustice in the world. My response, Lewis's response, would be that if there was no God, you would not know that the world was unjust. Because only if there is justice with a capital J will you recognize injustice. So a lot of Lewis's apologetics is Platonic in the sense that he tries to show us things that could not have evolved. We couldn't have made them up. There's a higher thing of which we are a reflection, right? So our desire for heaven, look, the fact that I desire food proves that I'm a creature made for eating. The fact that I desire drink proves I'm a creature made for drinking, even though I'm a Southern Baptist. Okay, now, if I'm in the middle of a desert, I might die for lack of water, right? My desire doesn't prove I'm going to get it, but my desire seems to suggest that there is a satisfaction for that desire. The fact that I desire heaven, something beyond the physical world, suggests that there is something there that's the origin of that. And again, Lewis does it again and again. That's a very Platonic orientation. But in a more beautiful way, in the Chronicles of Narnia, in his fantasy world, he reminds us that Aslan's country, which is ultimately heaven, is greater than Narnia. So when the children, in the last book is called The Last Battle, when the children get there at the end, right, they realize, wait a minute, this is Narnia, but no, it's the perfected Narnia, of which our Narnia was just a shadow or an imitation, that there is a more real Narnia. You know, in the book called The Silver Chair, there's a great place that bridges together the imagination and the philosophy. And in The Silver Chair, these children from the earth are brought into Narnia to rescue Prince Rilian, who's the son of King Caspian. And Prince Rilian is imprisoned by this green witch and imprisoned in her underground lair. Okay, well, the children and Puddleglum, this guy, they come in and they rescue Prince Rilian, and they're about to go up to the surface, but the witch catches them. Now, the first time you read the book, you think the witch is going to try to kill them or zap them. But instead, the witch says, "Where are you going, children?" We're going up there. Up there? What do you mean up there? There is no up there. This is the world. And the kids, oh, no, there's the sun. Sun? What is this thing, sun? Did you make up this word? Well, haven't you ever seen a torch? Yes. Well, imagine if that torch was bigger and bigger and it hung from the roof. That's the sun. Oh, I see. We're playing a game. You imagined a torch, and you imagined what it would be if it was bigger and bigger, and you created the sun. But really, that's a game for children. You need to grow up, okay? What she's doing is putting them back in Plato's cave, making them believe that the shadows are the reality.
And the witch is like Sigmund Freud, right?
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same kind of Freud thing. And I would argue, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are homeschoolers and classical Christian schoolers, which I love. Let me just say something to you. This is a challenge I got from Bodhi Baca, my friend, that I've known for 30 years. He said, you parents, you sacrifice time and money to give your kids a Christian education, to raise them up in the Christian world. You do all this sort of stuff. And then for a little handful of vanity, you send them to Harvard or Princeton so they can destroy everything you've done in one semester. Well, that's basically what's happening. This is, can I say this? It's even better than the play, because in Plato's allegory of the cave, people have grown up in the cave and that's all they've known. But the kids in Narnia have actually seen the sun. They've seen Aslan. They know that lions and sun, they know those things are real. And yet, in a few pages, the witch convinces them that what they know is real is actually insubstantial. So, I mean, that is one of the best reworkings of Plato's, the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic that I've read. But it's written in a way that children can understand it.
Yes, right there in the cave of Underland. Well, again, just some great material from Plato to Christ. The book's been out a couple of months, but again, 230 pages, 12 chapters. And matter of fact, that was the 12th chapter we were talking about, but we skipped over quite a bit, which is why we encourage you to get a copy of the book. And we have information about that, so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. Also, I have a link to your YouTube channel on which you're getting going, because that's a place where people can watch you in action. And most importantly, if somebody would like to contact you, I do encourage young people that might be thinking about a good Christian education, especially if they'd love to be under an English professor with this much enthusiasm, you got to check out Houston Baptist University. And of course, you have written in the past about the importance of classical Christian education. I mentioned just a few minutes ago some of your books, but especially The Road to Virtue in Tolkien and Lewis, Restoring Beauty, the Good, the True, and the Beautiful in the writings of C.S. Lewis, On the Shoulders of Hobbits. I guess I should mention that before. And of course, we mentioned that one, Atheism on Trial, refuting the modern arguments against God. As we found out, some of those can be found in the writings of the Greek classics. And so again, Louis, we appreciate the fact that you have written this book, and we really appreciate you giving us an hour today so we can kind of listen in on the kinds of things I suspect you share with your students every day at Houston Baptist University.
Well, thank you so much. And right now I'm going to run off to a meeting where our English department is going to talk. How do we maintain our devotion to not only Christ, but to the classics, to this kind of education? Because it's under attack, Kerby. It's under attack even in Christian schools. And we need to be strong. And strange enough that a pagan writer named Plato can help us do that.
Well, you go get them. And again, Louis Markos. And again, if you want more information about him, we have it on the website. We have information about his book and all sorts of great resources. But let's get back to some of the issues in the news. I needed to break from that because we're going to be talking about, of course, new Supreme Court justice. We're going to be talking about Ukraine. Number of videos that have been circulating. I thought we'd comment about that, especially since it gets it into the issue of immigration, which we're not ignoring, as well as, if we have time, some other interesting policies developing in hospitals related to whether or not you get treatment if you've been vaccinated or not. Kind of interesting there. And of course, before we're all done, we'll look at some of the election material. Have a good piece by Jerry Newcomb, also one on the Senate election. So we'll see if we can get all of that into 1 hour. If we can't, well, we've always got tomorrow. And of course, don't forget that we have our Friday weekend edition. Penna Dexter will be back with us. Kelly Shackelford will be back with us. I'm looking forward to that as well. So let's take a break. We'll get into the news, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We will probably spend more time talking about this first story on Friday because Kelly Shackelford will be with us. But let me mention right now that we do have an announcement that the Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is now deciding that he will step down. Now, there's some reasons for that. Well, the obvious one is he's 83, but he could hang on for a little bit longer. But there's been kind of a public pressure campaign forcing him to step down. You might say, why? Back to one of my favorite lines, you can never be liberal enough. It's very rare that Stephen Breyer is not the obvious liberal voice on the Supreme Court. He's been a dependable voice for a view of liberal interpretation of the Constitution called a living Constitution. We have a booklet, by the way, on constitutional interpretation if you'd like to understand the two different camps in terms of how to understand that. But on almost every case, he has been a dependable voice. I've said before that the Supreme Court isn't so much a 6-3 as it's a 3-3-3. The three dependable votes are, of course, the three liberals. That would be Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan. But there have been a few times when Stephen Breyer has either maybe agreed with the liberals but written a dissenting concurrence or something of that nature, or in a few cases actually hasn't been in lockstep. So the bottom line is there has been a push to remove him. One, because he's been there for 28 years, first appointed back in 1994 by Bill Clinton, and to maybe then put in someone who is younger, even more radical, even more liberal. Now, if I were if I were Joe Biden, I would certainly say the obvious nominee would be Merrick Garland. Now, if you don't remember who Merrick Garland is, he is currently the Attorney General, but he was put forward as an opportunity to actually, under Barack Obama, place one of maybe a little more moderate, but still liberal members of the Supreme Court. And the decision was made by the leadership in the United States Senate that indeed they were not going to consider him. If Joe Biden were to put him forward, I mean, the argument would be hard to say, you mean you're not going to put this person on the court either? You prevented him from being on the court the first time. I mean, if you were really thinking about that, it would be a hard argument for any Republican to argue against, other than the fact that now that we've had him on the position of the Attorney General, we recognize he was a lot more radical than we were told he was going to be. But I will set that aside. Because, first of all, Joe Biden doesn't care what I have to think or anybody else. But more to the point, he's already signaled that he would like to put a black woman on the court. Now, you've had Thurgood Marshall, you've got Clarence Thomas, and this would be the first time you'd have an African-American woman. Is he thinking about Kamala Harris? Okay, that's just a joke, but, who knows? But we will find out, and I'm sure over the next 2 days, before we have Kelly Shackelford in studio, we'll probably have a little better understanding of what's being considered. I think if Joe Biden were smart, he wouldn't wait too long, he'd put somebody up there, because if you wait for months, then the argument can always be, well, then we really want to wait till after the elections. And I'm thinking quite likely, as we'll talk about before this hour is up, that Republicans may control the United States Senate, and that makes it much more difficult at that point to get one of your nominees through. But we're just at the early stages of the decision by Stephen Breyer to step down, and we'll see where that takes us over the next couple of weeks. So let's get to the first article that I have posted, and that is on Ukraine. This one comes from Conrad Black. I've quoted from him before, and I thought this was pretty fair, because what has been, I think, so disturbing, and I alluded to that the first hour, is that if you are supporting the action of putting troops in, if not Ukraine, in nearby countries, then that is seen as patriotic, but it's being attacked by some conservatives as necessarily wanting to have some kind of aggression to provide more money for the military-industrial complex. If, on the other hand, you want to ask, is it really in the United States' best interest to deploy money, materials, and troops to defend Ukraine from Russia, you're seen as a Russian sympathizer. And it has been, I think, very disturbing to see both sides of individuals that we've talked about before, sometimes interviewed on this program, kind of shooting back and forth at each other. So, to his credit, Conrad Black put it this way: the most aggressive left-wing media wants to escalate the feud with Russian President Vladimir Putin to the point of driving Russia into the arms of China. This is the only way Russia, whose GDP is smaller than Canada's, could seriously damage the West. On the other hand, he says, some conservative commentators, including some of the stars at Fox News, are unreasonably accusing those who favor resisting Russian aggression in Ukraine as being warmongers and trying to propel America into endless, useless wars again. He says there's a legitimate American and Western interest in not allowing Russia to trample an independent nation of 40 million underfoot in the middle of Europe to the embarrassment of the Western alliance, and it is not a difficult scenario to avoid. And he reminds us, as you go through the article, which I will let you read in its entirety, that since the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, the status of Ukraine has never been clear. And he takes us through some of the stories going all the way back to the Mongols, Peter the Great, and a number of others. And if you've ever been over, and I've never been to Ukraine, but I have been many times to Hungary, you have to feel sorry for these countries that were taken over and then taken over again and taken over by another group, constantly in the midst of conflict and warfare, something we've seen, of course, in Israel in the past, but we've also seen in Central Europe. So when we come back from the break, I want to take a couple of different angles on Ukraine. Then we're going to move on to some other issues that I think are really important. First is this particular piece that came out today from Dr. Jim Dennison. Now, if you were listening to us yesterday, we spent an hour with him on his book, The Coming Tsunami. Last night, I had a chance to listen his question and answer period as the kind of the breakout for his book. But he has a good piece on why should America care what happens in Ukraine. So it's making that case. Then Jim Garrity, how to stop a volcano of violence in Europe. I'm not sure how you can. We have at least 100,000 Russian troops armed with tanks, missiles, all their equipment, and we're going to counter that with, about 8,000 troops? I don't see it happening. And then also a piece that I'll bring by our good friend Gary Bauer about what NATO is or is not doing about all of this. And then we're going to move on to some other topics, because there are certainly other things that are relevant to your life. And as I sometimes think about these issues, I don't want to ignore issues in the news. Everybody's talking about Ukraine, but I really want to talk about the things that affect you and your family, your faith, your family, and your freedom. So I'm going to get into some of the other articles we've posted here today because they affect you directly. I'm sure Ukraine could affect us indirectly, but we'll give it some time. Then we're going to move on to some other topics that mean something to you and your family. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, a news story reported that the University of Memphis was offering professors $3,000 to infuse their courses with diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. When we talked about this on my radio program, my guest wondered if professors who were already doing this for free might feel slighted. Social justice concepts like critical race theory and anti-racism have been injected into college classes for some time, but this announcement brought these ideas out in the open. An all-faculty email obtained by the Free Beacon shows that the university offered a $1,500 stipend after professors redesigned their curricula, with another $1,500 after teaching the redesigned course. The University Working Group links to a report that emphasizes the need for anti-racism, which is a term popularized by Ibram X. Kendi. It calls for designing anti-racist syllabi and developing skills and appropriate dispositions for facilitating anti-racist classroom discussion. As you might imagine, the proposal has attracted the attention of Tennessee lawmakers who are critical of offering such incentives to professors, and one professor at the university explained that they have had a hard time retaining good faculty at our salary levels, so anytime you see money being spent on non-student or non-faculty causes, it makes you scratch your head. You've probably heard pundits, politicians, and professors dismiss the idea that social justice ideas like critical race theory and anti-racism are being taught in education. This latest example not only shows that these ideas are being taught, but at least one university wants to provide a financial incentive for teaching those ideas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, let's see if we can talk about Ukraine for a few more minutes. And again, this comes from our friend Jim Dennison. Why should America care about what happens in Ukraine? He points out that he has never been to Ukraine. I have not either, but certainly gives us a little bit of facts and information. First of all, second largest nation in the European continent after Russia itself. Ukraine, if you are trying to get a sense of how big it is, about the size of the state of Texas, surrounded by the Black Sea to the south, Russia to the east, Belarus to the north, Poland to the northwest, and then you have Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova to the west. So it gives you a little bit of an idea. You hopefully could be able to find it on a map, but point I've made before is a lot of Americans probably couldn't, and that's why they're saying, why do we want to go and actually involve ourselves militarily in a country I can't even find on the map, but that's where we find ourselves. After World War II, he points out that the entire country became part of the Soviet Union, gained its independence in 1991, but interestingly enough, I've always argued, and I think most people would agree with this, that Ukraine is really two countries. You have the eastern part, which is much more Russian, and then you have the western part, which is more kind of Slovakian or Hungarian. There is a sense in which, even though technically it is one country, we've seen before what happens when you put a number of countries together. Those of you that are a bit older might remember we used to have a thing called Czechoslovakia. We used to have a country called Yugoslavia, but after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the so-called Iron Curtain and all of the rest, the Soviet bloc, many of those broke into smaller countries, and there is a sense in which there is kind of a little bit of a merging together of two different kinds of groups in the same country of Ukraine. Let's move on, though. One of the things that Jim Dennison says is there's a couple of arguments that are being used right now for why Ukraine matters to the United States. First, an invasion could affect the global order. If Russia is allowed to invade, occupy, and annex its neighbor, that would be inherently unstable in the international system. Probably true. Some people wonder whether or not this would be an attempt to come and take over the entire country all the way down to the capital of Kiev. But okay, I'll set that aside. One, it could affect the global order. Number two, the invasion could spark a wider war. One would certainly hope not, but if the Russians succeed in establishing a sphere of influence, he believes, at least this one foreign policy expert, that Poland, Romania, and Slovakia would be next. Maybe, but that's based on kind of a whole series of dominoes falling. Don't know that that would be the case. Number three, Western credibility is on the line. The United States has spent billions of dollars to help Ukraine build up its military defenses. NATO has warned that a Russian invasion would lead to devastating economic sanctions. And that, to me, may be one of the most significant reasons why you hear so many people not even willing to consider the alternative. This money has been spent. Individuals in Ukraine have connections to this government, lest I remind you of the connection of Ukraine to Hunter Biden and ultimately to Joe Biden, but also to many other individuals that have received some kind of benefit from Ukraine, as well as, of course, the benefit that various individuals would gain if indeed there was a military action. There have been some that have been critical of our actions there, have pointed out this individual making this case also either works for Lockheed Martin or used to. This person here maybe has invested in the military industrial complex. So there's all sorts of, if you will, emotional reasons for that as well. And then number four, Western security could be threatened. This idea is that Vladimir Putin demands that all nuclear weapons be removed from Europe. And, of course, you have to wonder what happened in Ukraine with the fall of Soviet Union. There's just all sorts of questions we could get into. But just before we move on to some other articles, I think, Joe, certainly Jim Dennison spends some time talking about why Ukraine might matter to us as Christians. Because, as he said, we have 78% of the Ukrainian adults, that's about 35 million people, that are Orthodox Christians. Obviously different than, say, Protestant and Catholic, but still Christians in the broadest sense of the word. One of the Ukrainian evangelical leaders there says prayer is our spiritual weapon. God can undo what the politicians are planning. And so, again, he spends some time talking about the fact that we should be concerned about those who might find themselves affected by a possible incursion from Russia. So those are some of the arguments that have been made. But as I pointed out just a minute ago, Jim Garrity begins to say, you know, we've got some issues here, and that is you could ultimately, as the Washington Post, David Ignatius says, a potential war could leave a volcano of violence festering in the middle of Europe. And there's really no easy way to talk about stopping the 100,000 Russian troops armed with tanks, missiles, and other top-of-the-line military equipment, also supported by the Russian Air Force. And as I mentioned just the other day, the issue of cyber attacks. I talked about that on Monday, that could all affect it in one way or another. But let me finish off with a piece by Gary Bauer, reminding us again, not only 100,000 troops, but he estimates there's about 1,200, that's 1,200 tanks that are massed across Ukraine's eastern border. If you've seen some of the videos, and I've watched some of those, of a train just going next to a train with all of these tanks, you realize this is an incredibly armed area of the world right now. And the response, at least from the United States, is to put 8,500, that'd be 8,500 U.S. troops on heightened alert. Now, they're not in Ukraine, first of all. They are in neighboring countries. I won't go into all the details there right now. But again, the question that Gary Bauer's asking is kind of a question that I remember former President Donald Trump asking. What's NATO doing about all this? Because after all, NATO, those particular countries that are part of NATO, are going to be much more adversely affected by this than, say, the United States. So he gives us a rundown real quickly, and then we'll take a break and get into some other topics. One of those is, of course, the British are deploying defensive weapon systems, which could possibly be helpful. But even one of the British defense ministers suggested that these defensive weapon systems really are no threat to Russia. And if that is the British assessment, you got to believe that that's probably Vladimir Putin's assessment. So much. Canada is sending a small contingent of special forces. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are sending weapons to Ukraine that have been provided to them for their own defense from Russia. Denmark is sending one ship and a few F-16 fighters to Lithuania. Spain is sending 4 fighter jets to Bulgaria and 3 ships to bolster NATO forces in the Black Sea. Turkey is sending armed drones. And, of course, the United States has deployed 2 aircraft carrier strike forces to the Mediterranean, but these deployments were planned actually months ago and maybe have nothing to do with that as well. So Gary Bauer goes on to say it's important to understand that Ukraine is in Russia's backyard. It's like Mexico to us. If European NATO nations are unwilling to do anything serious about this, maybe it's also unlikely that the United States will do anything unilaterally. As I pointed out before, on Monday, we are quite convinced that Germany is doing nothing. As a matter of fact, actually seems to be cozying up to Russia right at the moment. If you look at the polls, Gary Bauer pulls that one off. One more recent one shows that only 15% of Americans support the deployment of troops to Ukraine. And again, sometimes the White House tends to look at those polls. And he says, I think, if anything, there are probably a fair number of Americans thinking right now, what I'm sure you're thinking right now, while we're working so hard to try to defend the Ukrainian border, what are we doing to defend the southern border? The other day, somebody was saying, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, who, by the way, just announced she's going to run for re-election again, which I thought was interesting. But anyway, wants to get a vote immediately on defending the border, that we should keep the actual territorial integrity of any country. And so she wants to defend the border, but it isn't the United States southern border with Mexico and Latin America. It is the eastern border of Ukraine. And so, again, we'll probably impose some tough sanctions on Russia, but it's interesting to see whether or not Germany will follow us. And again, it will be interesting to see what other NATO countries decide to do. But that's a quick, and I'm sure maybe a little too quick, analysis of what we have been hearing about. But when we come back from the break, I want to get into some other issues. It's important to recognize that we will continue to follow what's happening in Ukraine. We've got a lot of things here at home that we need to address, and one of those has to do with the issue of immigration, which I just alluded to. And I want to teach you something about how the media makes sure that you don't hear some of the things we talk about here on Point of View. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me, for just a minute, while I'm holding up our booklet on media bias, share a little bit about how any administration, both Republican or Democratic administration, deals with bad news. And that is, you have to let it out. There are job reports that turn out to be dismal. There are stories or scandals or all sorts of things. And the classic way to do that is to dump them on Friday at the very end. And so it can't be necessarily making the newspapers or any of the news cycles on Friday. Over the weekend, sometimes they don't get picked up right away. And so by Monday, that's a good way to, if you will, take out the trash. And both Republican administrations have done it and Democratic administrations have done it. But there's another trick that the Biden administration used the other day, and I want you to have discernment. I want you to, when you see an article, you read a piece, you hear me talk on radio, you hear other commentators talk, or you watch television, you know a little bit more about what's going on. And that is, I think it is best illustrated by two different kinds of dogs. There has been an argument over the years that when there is a liberal president in the Oval Office, that the liberal media, and by and large most of the established media is liberal. I don't think I have to make that case. If you need any evidence of that, this booklet goes into it in some great detail, and you can document that, but I think you already know that. So they've oftentimes referred to, when there is a liberal press covering a liberal president, they're kind of lapdogs. But there's the other side of that occurred to me the other day. Conservatives, sometimes when that takes place, tend up to be the Pavlov dogs. They might remember Pavlov, ring the bell, and he starts to salivate. And that's exactly the game that was played the other day. It came time to release the immigration reports, which are dismal. As a matter of fact, it has been one of the most significant times in which people have tried to sneak across the border in December ever. So you don't want to release it. And what they decided to do, whether it was intentional, which I think it was, or accidental, is they released the immigration numbers just moments after the president referred to Fox News' Peter Doocy as a stupid, and I can't say the rest of that word, and I wouldn't anyway. But you probably by now have heard the back and forth. As a matter of fact, later on, even the president said, okay, pal, nothing personal. I love the way he said that. Anyway, so he knew as soon as that happened, and whether he did it intentionally or not, everybody in the press corps says, oh, we now know what's going to happen, because now that they have criticized Fox News and Peter Doocy, all the news cycle over the next couple of hours is all going to be about what the president said about Fox News' reporter, Peter Doocy. And so we'll now put out in the news these dismal immigration reports. Just like a Pavlov dog. Ring the door, there we go. You know, and I think it's a good illustration that in some respects the conservative press corps couldn't help themselves. They had to just focus on what the president said about one of the reporters, as if the previous president hadn't said some pretty awful things about some of the other reporters, and that completely caused everybody not to pay attention to what I'm going to share right now. In December 2021, there were 135,000 unique individuals that were encountered at the border. Now, recognize when we talk about people that are encountered on the border, for every one we catch, who knows how many we miss. So what this was an increase of about 5% over the previous month, making this December perhaps a record-setting December. So at a time when everybody's focused on whatever it might be, Ukraine, inflation, or that week on the fact that Peter Doocy was called by the president a name that we shouldn't say in polite company, we simply didn't get into the issue at all. And that brings me to one of the other interesting videos that's making the rounds. This video was actually produced by, again, Fox News, in which they actually have been able to videotape some incredible things, because what they showed were dozens and dozens and dozens of single, mostly male adult migrants were being shuttled from a processing center in Texas to a local airport. that was the Harlingen Airport, and flown into various cities in the country. Well, this is something which has been taking place for some time, but it's one thing for somebody to talk about it. It's quite another for you to see the video. It's pretty easy to find if you would like to go and find it. And this led to the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas, that would be Dan Patrick, who I've known since the days he was a state senator, saying this is a classic example of smuggling people into the United States. And I think at first when I heard that, I said, well, that's maybe a little bit of hyperbole. But then you start realizing that if an individual did this, we would consider it to be smuggling. But the government does it, and we say, well, it's okay. And I'm thinking maybe he's a little closer to that after all. And it turns out that if you follow the video, and I would encourage you to watch it for yourself, because it just illustrates again that we've been told that these are families. It's obvious these are not families. These are almost all men. And these are individuals who then are actually following in cabs, going to then the Valley International Airport in Harlingen, Texas, and then they're being sent all over the country. Some of them were smuggled in here. So first of all, they were smuggled by cartels, some of them admitting to paying up to $2,000 to criminal cartels. But now they're essentially being smuggled to all over the United States. Now, you might ask a very important question. I thought that if indeed somebody came here and we did not know whether or not they were to be in this country, we have a federal law known as Title 42, and especially if they're adult migrants, immigrants, undocumented aliens, whatever, illegal aliens, you can use whatever phrase you want to use, they were supposed to then be sent back. Even if they're claiming asylum, were they not to seek asylum in Mexico? They did under Trump. Supposedly, that's supposed to be happening now once again under Biden. But Jen Psaki the other day helped us out by saying, migrants who cannot be expelled under Title 42 are placed into immigration proceedings, and one of those avenues could be placement in alternative to detention programs in the interior of the United States. Sometimes that means moving migrants to other parts of the country to move to different detention facilities where they wait for their next steps in the immigration process. But I think you know what takes place. But if you don't, let me fill in the blanks. They go to that detention area. They're saying, I want to actually become a resident of this country, or I want to get a visa, or maybe they claim asylum. They give them a court date, and that will be May of 2023. So 18 months from now, we expect you to come back to this facility for a court date. How many of them do you think show up? And very, very few. And that's the game that gets played. And it's back to the point that I've made before, and that is that catch and release, as I like to jokingly say, works fine for those of us that like fly fishing, but it doesn't work very well for this situation. They go into the country, and many of them are never seen again. And again, when we look at these numbers, we now can come to a reasonable estimate that we've had at least 2 million illegal immigrants or migrants, whatever you want to call them, that have crossed into the border. Lest you think they're all coming here for an economic opportunity, let's go and do a quick analysis that comes from the Border Patrol Chief Rodney Scott. And Rodney Scott actually has interviewed the U.S. Border Patrol agents, and he mentions, for example, in just the October through whenever, I can't even find the date, 14 non-citizens who are actually on terror watch lists. So, yes, many of them are coming here for a good life. Some of them are coming here for maybe not such positive and beneficial ideas. And it's an illustration, again, of, as we've said, no longer is maybe California, Arizona, New Mexico, and especially Texas border states. Basically, every state, at least in the continental United States, is now a border state because those individuals are being put on airplanes and shipped off to other parts of the country. And much of this is done surreptitiously. But if you want to see what it looks like, check out some of the videos making their way around the internet right now, and it'll illustrate why, even though most people aren't talking about immigration, I think we'll continue talking about it here on Point of View. Let's take a break, and when we come back, a couple other issues to put on the table just to let you know that we've been following some of these stories. One, which is kind of interesting, Michael Rappaport, who is the actor and comedian, has put together a video that you probably will be seeing as well, in which he's watching how these individuals, in this case New York City, just simply walk in, load up shopping bags or sometimes garbage bags of everything they want, in this case from a Rite Aid, and walk right back out. Matter of fact, in one case, they walk right by the security guard and all he says is, "What's up?" Boy, unbelievable. But he's surprised by that, and if you've been listening to Point of View, you're not surprised. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, once again, let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to spend a little bit of time talking with our friend Steve Green for just about a few segments on the Museum of the Bible, some things happening right there. Of course, we appreciate all the work that he and his family have done over the years, so we'll get some info from him and some perspective. Also, Chelsea will be with us just by phone because we want to talk about that March for Life that took place last week and the number of young faces as well as all the incredible possible signs and other things, and maybe a look ahead to what might happen on this issue of abortion. Then, of course, Friday is our weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford, Penna Dexter, and, of course, we welcome your phone calls during any of those aspects of covering various issues in the news. But I thought just while a minute ago I was talking about this video, there is one that's kind of a hand video that was done by the actor Michael Rappaport. He's a comedian. He's an actor. You've probably seen him in a number of different things. Anyway, he did a social media post yesterday, and I thought it might be mentioning because he seems so surprised by all of this. Now, again, I recognize that if you're acting and you're involved in all sorts of things, you're not following the news, but how many videos have we seen? For example, I'll pick on my friends in California for a minute. In San Francisco, people just nonchalantly walking into a Walgreens or a grocery store, just filling up a grocery bag and walking right back out, right by sometimes a security guard. And yet he says, I can't believe this. And of course, I could show the video. Of course, I wouldn't, because he swears continuously. It's like, can't you communicate without using all sorts of words that we obviously would not want you to use in polite country or company or even on the radio? But nevertheless, he's just like, can you believe this? Blankety blank blank. And he talks about the fact that it's just kind of like people coming in and doing Christmas shopping. And he actually tags the new mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, about this. It had more than, I think last night, 132,000 views. You'll see it there as well. Talks about the guy basically going Christmas shopping. And if you watch it there, you see just kind of strolls in, picks up anything he needs at this Rite Aid, shampoo, whatever, all sorts of other different kind of cosmetics and any kind of staples that he needs. And then as he walks by the security guard, who doesn't even stop him, he goes, "What's up?" I mean, it's just like, I don't even care. And again, he's surprised by that. But this is what happens when you decide that we are not going to prosecute any theft under, for example, $950. It depends from which jurisdiction to another. But when you're not going to prosecute individuals, they know that they can do this with impunity, and that's exactly what is taking place. And, of course, that's happening in New York City. We've seen it happening in San Francisco, but we've seen it in Chicago and a variety of other places, but we've also seen it starting to happen in the suburbs as well. And so even though we might be thinking, well, I'm not going to live in any of those cities, if you live near those cities, and I started looking at the number of places, these would be different smaller cities and other areas where the homicide rate has gone up dramatically and where theft has gone up dramatically. A lot of them are places where we broadcast, and so pay attention to what's happening, and especially during this election of 2022. You need to find out who your district attorney is. And up until now, I think most of us probably couldn't have told us who our county judge was. And then came the pandemic and the lockdown. Some of us maybe couldn't tell us who was on the school board. And then we started hearing about critical race theory and pornographic ideas being dispensed basically in the classrooms and all sorts of mandates and all sorts of stuff. And now when we start seeing crime increasing, a lot of you probably couldn't tell me who your district attorney is, but I would encourage you to do some research and find out. Just before we end, I have been sitting on this story for a couple of days because I've been hearing about individuals that would not be able to receive life-saving treatment because they haven't received a vaccine. And so I wanted to get to the bottom of it because in some cases you recognize that the first statements that people make, they leave out an essential fact. But Matt Vespa put it this way. He said, the first time that I heard about the idea of death panels years ago, I thought that was a little bit over the top. But he says, I recognize that to curb the inevitable costs, rationing care probably was going to have to happen. And whether it happened before the issue of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, and I think that it did, it certainly is happening after that. And if you don't think so, just go to a kidney dialysis facility and ask how many people they've had to turn away. Well, this one has to do with a heart transplant. And this is a story now that's gotten enough national prestige. We know a little bit more about that. But this man in Boston needs a heart. He was on the transplant list. Matter of fact, I think he was first, although this article doesn't say that. But he's been removed from the transplant list because he didn't get his COVID shot. And so the argument is that he could perhaps die because he wasn't vaccinated against a virus that has a pretty significant survival rate. Okay, so I thought, let's dig into this a little bit more. And it turns out that this took place at a hospital that I'm familiar with. When I was in Connecticut and going to graduate school, we had a good friend of ours that was actually at Brigham Women's Hospital, and that's where this is taking place. It's Brigham and Women's Hospital now. It's basically a Harvard teaching facility. Now, the argument being made, you can evaluate for what it is that they argue that transplant recipients sometimes have a much higher risk of dying from COVID compared to non-transplant patients, I should say. But again, you can recognize that we also understand that even people that are vaccinated get COVID. So you can see that you understand why this might have been used as a criteria or criterion, if it was just that one particular one. But at the same time, you can see that what we've been hearing for the last couple of days is that, yes, there are people being removed from things like the transplant list simply because they aren't actually getting vaccinated. So that story is true, but maybe there's some backstory that you needed to know about, and I just gave it to you. Just before I go, let me mention that I have a very good piece by Jerry Newcomb in which I wanted you to be able to read it because he goes and quotes lots of individuals. When you talk about this whole idea of election and election integrity, you always have somebody saying, well, that's just one person's opinion. Well, this goes on for 3 pages, and he's quoting from Tim Head, Executive Director of the Faith and Family Coalition, Molly Hemingway, who's written about this, Hans von Spakowski, who's with a Heritage Foundation, who actually was with the Federal Elections Committee, Bob Knight, who's been on the program with us, Ken Blackwell, who actually is with the Family Research Council, but I believe wasn't he Secretary of State in Ohio? And he gives you a lot of good facts and figures that might be helpful if you are wanting to talk about this issue of election integrity. And our last piece, which I won't mention today, but we'll probably get back into on Friday, is the fact this particular article actually points out that as we've been doing more and more polling, it used to be about a couple of months ago a belief that there were maybe 4 Senate seats that Republicans might be vulnerable for and 4 Democratic Senate seats. Now the evidence is that the Republicans are in a clear lead, and the only place where there could be a switch is in these 4 Democratic seats. And it's also an illustration why, as we talked about just a minute ago, with Stephen Breyer stepping down, I think if the White House is paying attention, it quite likely could be a Republican Senate this time next year and make it a little harder to get some of your nominees through. So that's maybe why there will be a great urgency to put forward a nominee. And who knows, by Friday, maybe we'll be talking about that. Well, that's all we have for today. Tomorrow, Steve Green, Chelsea Yeoman with us. And I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer for posting these articles for us as well. Steve, thank you for your help, especially with our interview with Dr. Louis Markos. And I am looking forward to tomorrow and especially Friday. And I hope you are as well, because we look forward to seeing you right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.